what I'm going to talk about today, actually, it's not the first time around on this talk. I prepared it originally for a big formal named lecture in the United States that was a joint venture of biologists, geologists, geographers, and anthropologists. And they asked me to talk about the phenomenon of the Anthropocene. So it's a little bit stuffy as a talk because it's all written out for that reason. But it started out because a few years ago, I published an essay in an edited book about how certain kinds of entrenched narratives about environmental change in India had really structured our understanding of environmental history here. And I thought that essay would make a nice small book, like just a really, short book. And I started to revise it into a book. And that was many years ago, actually, and that book is still not finished. Life intervened, both in the form of moving cross-country to University of Pennsylvania, and a new project, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today, called Land Cover 6K. So the book is really still half written. But while I was sort of, feeling guilty about not working on my book, another kind of environmental narrative that really wasn't all that dominant at the time I started the book gathered and took force, and you might say engulfed all of the other environmental narratives. And that's, of course, this narrative of the Anthropocene, right? So there's not, I think, any need to explain the idea of the Anthropocene to an audience like this. And I would say that already there's something of a kind of Anthropocene industry at work. And some of the kinds of objections that I and others had to this term, I think now already feel kind of old-fashioned and basically futile. But nevertheless, what I want to talk about today is someone who's working on long-term change, and especially on the entangled, inseparable relationships between humans and the non-human world. There's still something, to me, rather troubling about this idea. So I want to argue today that the Anthropocene concept, for all its intended value of highlighting the significance of the current crisis, is also deeply problematic. Now, let me be clear that I am not disputing the magnitude or the significance of current levels of anthropogenic impact on the Earth system. This is obviously beyond doubt. But rather, my concern is with the attempts to define a new temporality, let's say, and the debate that shifted concern away from process, and instead, by tracing what, as I hope we'll see, is a well-worn path down pre-existing narrative of change, really risks undermining its own overt political aim of creating awareness and concern in the present crisis. So the Anthropocene concept is, at one level, an argument about human history, and it's an argument about human nature. It's an effort to temporally fix what we might call distinct modalities of human-environment relationships. And the novelty of combining these disparate agentive forces, the human and the non-human, which has so dazzled both humanists and physical scientists, as this, of course, has long been an area of primary research interest for scholars in archaeology, and political ecology, and other fields. So before rushing into a kind of pronouncement about the nature of human impact, I think it's worth thinking a little bit about how these areas of work might be able to help us to understand some of the processes and patterns of long-term change. So in this talk, I want to situate the Anthropocene narrative within a broader consideration of the power of stories more generally, and a role of both of the sciences and the humanities in evaluating these. So to propose a new modality of human environment agency is to tell a story of change. So like other narratives of decline, this one, the Anthropocene narrative, has a starting point, it has a crisis, and then it has a kind of downward slide. So defining the Anthropocene as a period, as a time period, rather than as a process, requires, like any other kind of chronology building, certain kinds of ontological decisions, right? What divides the then from the now? How do we know that these are really different? So not only Anthropocene talk, but other environmental narratives, as we'll see, also make these same kinds of judgments. So in environmental history, in environmental science, in archaeology, restoration ecology, and also in public policy and environmental activism, we see over and over a series of stock narratives, that is, stories that are built on foundational assumptions about nature, about culture, and about change. And these stock narratives are surprisingly mobile and tenacious. They appear not only in policies and in popular culture, but also in things like scientific papers. So I want to make just two simple points today. First, I always wonder why that slide is there. Okay, I might be two slides ahead now. First, anyway, listen, is that narratives have power, right? Even in science. And this is not a controversial point, but certainly within archaeology and environmental science, where I spend most of my time, we perhaps not paid sufficient attention to this. Narratives are not, however, determinative. That is, we can think critically about how we constitute observations as evidence and how we deploy those observations in ways that speak back to taken for granted intellectual frameworks. That is, we can't avoid telling stories, but we can certainly evaluate the narratives we read and also those that we make. So my talk today really is meant to bridge the doing of science with the intellectual analysis within which scientific evidence is always deployed. There's no simple way, of course, to step outside of our own frameworks. And as I hope to illustrate today, the idea that we can, for example, evaluate the narratives of environmental history with the evidence of environmental science really ignores the theory-ladenness of all forms of evidence, scientific and humanistic. Can and we should take seriously the potential of the non-human material worlds to resist our cultural constructions, and in so doing, help us to expose our ignorance. Okay, so let's turn briefly now to narratives. Let's see if we're, yeah. Okay, so environmental narratives tend to build on a shared set of foundational assumptions, including, but certainly not limited to, the separation between nature and culture, the idea of a balance of nature or natural equilibrium, assumptions about what constitutes human nature, and also a quest for temporal baselines. In South Asia, as in other places, what I like to call baseline thinking often uses the pre-colonial as a really mostly imagined and entirely homogenized starting point for the beginning of what's often seemed to be real environmental change. And this is, of course, very reminiscent of recent discussions about the Anthropocene. So let's look today just two basic storylines: upward-oriented stories about progress and improvement, and downward-oriented stories of decline and decay. So progressivist schemes are not very fashionable as master narratives these days. It's not a very optimistic era. But as we'll see, they still play an important role in environmental narratives. Here we tend to find certain kinds of people or of ideas that are associated with upward movement. Modern, Western, scientific people and ideas, for example, and others who are not. Pre-modern, non-Western, traditional people, say. In the context of South Asia, the classic example of progressivist schemes derive from colonial science. Colonial scholars and administrators, often the same people, saw colonized peoples as situated in a progression of agricultural and ecological sophistication, from primitive swidden or slash and burn shifting agriculturalists to more advanced plow cultivators, who nevertheless still lacked what they saw as modern scientific understanding of cultivation practice or of forest management. Swidden, for example, by many colonial administrators as not only primitive and hence ancient, but also as irrational and destructive, posing a threat to forest environments through the use of fire and the clearing of what were seen to be pristine forests. And incidentally, despite a huge amount of careful research documenting that agroecological sophistication of much shifting cultivation, this perspective that we still see quite a bit repeated in conservation circles. So for colonial officials, the perceived destruction and disorder of indigenous farming demanded the imposition of scientific disciplined knowledge. Within the British Empire, this progressivist and civilizational narrative was indexed especially to the notion of improvement. So one key area of improvement, I think very well known to this audience, I suspect, was the development of what was called scientific forestry, with its logic of management, of rationality, profit, and planning. 19th century scientific forestry, which was focused on managing forests for timber production primarily, built the foundation of an ongoing legacy of displacement and dispossession of forest people in the name of conservation. So it's critically important to realize that even when foresters had or have quite exemplary motives, they still tended to assume a priori that certain kinds of people, and this is the main point, traditional, backward, irrational people perhaps, necessarily had specific kinds of relationships with the natural environment, say destructive or wasteful environments. Okay, so declensionist accounts. Let's see. This doesn't seem right. It seems like I missed something. Okay, so there's no question that current ideas about humans and the environment are dominated now, not by progressivist accounts, but by what historians like to call declensionist accounts, a word I only learned like 2 years ago, I will say, so don't feel bad if you hadn't heard it. So these are narratives about loss, of degradation and kind of doom, right? So in India, some nationalist scholars simply inverted the British colonial perspective, shifting the signs of value in colonial discourse of backward farmers and need of Western intervention to construct instead histories and ecologies of a kind of golden age in which traditional arrangements were seen to exemplify an ecosystem-like state of balance, harmony, and stability. Gill and Guha, for example, in their influential synthesis of Indian environmental history, paint a very rosy picture of pre-colonial traditional balance. At its most extreme, this perspective sees caste as analogous to ecological niche, suggesting that pre-colonial South Asians formed a kind of textbook ecosystem that was stable, sustaining to its members, and in equilibrium. Gill and Guha argue here that traditional harmony with nature was interrupted by colonial intervention, which brought deforestation, degradation, and a breakdown of traditional forms of ecological management, these assumed to always be communal, harmonious, and equable. So as I've discussed elsewhere, depicting pre-colonial worlds as being unchanging or equilibrial deprives both the humans and the natural world of their dynamic histories, inverting colonial era discourses without subjecting them to serious empirical challenge. Ecological romanticism relies fundamentally on these declensionist accounts. And maybe because there's not much action before this fall, this perspective doesn't seem to really encourage actual study of the past. The past, if it's assumed to be static, is extremely boring, so why would you study it, really? You know? So good stories, of course, need a crisis. And the crisis itself, the loss of the forest, of tradition, of innocence, that's really central to this literature. So declensionist stories of environmental change in India tend to dwell on the precise timing of the turning point. Was it capitalism? Was it the British? You know, what was it? Rather like current debates about the timing of the Anthropocene. So both progressivist and declensionist narratives, though, struggle with the problems of beginnings. What was the original natural state of the South Asian vegetation? And of course, there really is no such thing. The subcontinent, as I hope you know, was a human-occupied landscape long before the end of the Pleistocene. So in a real sense, there is no human-free analog for paleoecology, no originary period against which really to measure later transformation in that sense. So both progressivist and declensionist narratives are in fact variants of the same basic theory of socialized nature. From an original state of nature, we might call it, human action is added. This leads either to equilibrium, harmony with nature, followed by disequilibrium, the romantic model, or its reverse, the colonial model. But all agree, however, that equilibrium is possible, and secondly, that an original condition of nature has been modified unnaturally by human beings. Colonial, borrow a term from paint a picture of primitivity and ignorance leading to ecological destruction, checked only by the application of science and good management, then romantic vision simply replaced this transition into the colonial and post-colonial periods. So progressivist and declensionist accounts then are really more alike than they are different. Mirror images assembled from a common stock of assumptions. And allowing for sort of interstitial moments of stability or harmony, these narrative modalities really come together in development discourses, both technocratic and activist. So much development thinking in India partakes of both declensionist and progressivist narratives, postulating, for example, that indigenous people once lived in harmony with nature until the forces of Western civilization or modernity, colonialism, capitalism, destroyed both nature and culture. This sorry state of affairs requires Western science to redirect the story into a narrative of progress. So in these stories, the temporal location of loss, the moment when harmony is disrupted and ontologically new forms of people or of practice emerge, tends to be contested in the literature. That's what we're fighting about, not what happened, but when. And this, again, is an interesting parallel to a lot of current discussions about the Anthropocene. So this is all a little abstract. So let's look at one pervasive narrative about the history of India's environment, the declensionist, what I call myth of the primeval forest. In this sylvan tale, most or all of India was once covered in forests, a condition that was consistently degraded through time, but with particular moments of loss that are associated with modernity, with colonialism, or sometimes even, as we'll see, with the introduction of Islam. Outside of India, too, there's widespread assumption that the trajectory of landscape change has been from forests to open areas, with forests always in decline relative to the growth of human populations. And this assumption, as we get to the end of the talk, is explicitly built into anthropogenic land cover change models, as we'll see. So even without the support of any paleoenvironmental data, many scholars have assumed that the clearing of primeval forests was always an issue at some point in the past, and that originally the subcontinent was entirely cloaked in forests. So I've written quite a number of articles about how environmental histories make these kinds of assumptions and how archaeological and paleoecological data can be used to evaluate them. But it's important to realize that environmental science itself is not immune to the lure of stories, right? So in classical or Clemensian ecology, the notion of a climax vegetation is related to concepts of plant succession, especially primary succession taking place under natural, non-human conditions. Like models of cultural evolution, succession studies substitute space for time. That is, although vegetation succession explicitly refers to a diachronic process, it's about change through time, it's often constructed or reconstructed on the basis of observations of a spatial series of extant plant communities rather than by using paleoecological data. So it's meant to be historical, but it's made out of space rather than time. So historical evidence is, then you might say, subverted to an imaginative history. So concepts of vegetation succession, and especially climax, suggest a beginning and an end, the latter governed by a stable, albeit dynamic equilibrium. The vegetation climax constitutes, say, the mythical origin point for both progressivist and declensionist discourses. It really is the state of nature that humans will eventually despoil. A separation of humans from the natural world, that of course is itself profoundly non-ecological. Okay, this is hardly the state of the art in ecology, certainly, and I want to acknowledge that. But still pervasive frameworks calling for the construction of human-free nature as analytical baselines can sometimes lead to rather curious results. Paired with the common assumption that human impacts are progressive, they're linear and accelerating, the result can be narratives that may completely reverse chronology in an effort to make nature prior to culture. Such unexamined assumptions don't necessarily structure scientific procedures themselves, but they do work in some ways sometimes to align interpretations. So let's just look at one example and just from one paper. So for example, in a study of the impact of cardamom cultivation on montane forest ecosystems in Sri Lanka, Duckel and his colleagues carefully sampled, identified, and analyzed vegetation assemblages from plots in the Knuckles Forest Reserve, where cultivation has been banned since 1985. At first glance, the analysis seems straightforward, and I'm sure the science is great, no problem, right? Areas of what they call cardamom plantation are compared to areas of natural forest in terms of stem density, stand basal area, canopy openness, and soil nutrients. But a closer look at this specific forest reveals a problem, however. As Duckall et al. Note, all of the forest has been potentially subject to agriculture in the past. And although official records note that about 3,000 hectares of this more than 17,000 hectare reserve were formerly under cardamom cultivation, this is known to be a vast underestimation. So indeed, as they write, this is a quote, "We observed very little natural forest without planted cardamom during 3 years of fieldwork," end quote, explaining that some areas have been under cultivation for more than a century. So this is borne out by the presence of cardamom in all of their study plots. In order to create a baseline, the older agroforestry plots are, however, simply recast as nature or natural forest, their human histories erased, with more recently abandoned agroforestry plots standing in for degraded culture, cardamom plantations. So this very long-term complex history of planting, fallowing, replanting, and abandoning specific locations is thus recast as an older nature and a younger culture, the former pristine and the latter degraded by definition. Now, this construction of a nature-culture duality out of a mosaic of what we might call socio-natural spaces creates, in the end, a curiously inverted chronology. So Duckall et al. Note, quote, the densities of seedlings, saplings, and small trees in cardamom plantations have not recovered to pre-disturbance values during the 25 years since active management ceased, end quote, okay. But the so-called natural forest here is not really pre-disturbance at all. If anything, it's post-disturbance, right? Further along or later in a successional pathway, not earlier. So wanting to see the natural as an analytical category, it was first constructed by carving away the human contribution to this socio-natural landscape, and then set up as necessarily prior to human disturbance. But the temporality is really inverted here. The plots imagined to represent nature are really successionally later, in some sense, than the plots imagined to represent culture. And this inversion leads the authors to overlook the fact that they actually know the answer to how long what they call recovery may take. So they note rather wistfully, quote, the existence of pervasive impacts of cardamom cultivation so long after active management ceased suggests that recovery to pre-disturbance conditions will take a very long time. In fact, if they're right about the history of cultivation, and I'm sure they are, they know precisely how long this process will take. If the oldest cardamom plantings are really around 100 years old, but with most beginning in the 1960s, it will take somewhere between 50 to around 110 years for the degraded plots to begin to look like the natural plots. So this is clear when we reimagine the pre-disturbance natural forest plots as fields left fallow for longer than neighboring locations and not as untrammeled nature. Okay, so stories of forest lost and forest regained are certainly not limited to scholars. And I've beaten up on environmental historians a lot in the past. Now I was mean to some environmental scientists. So now let's go after someone else, right? That these kinds of stories also underpin things like environmental activism. So consider, for example, an account presented by the Energy and Resources Institute's website for children, EduGreen, on the history of forests in India. And I put it up here really just for me to read. I know the font's too small. Okay, this is, again, what they're telling kids about forests. There's enough evidence to show that dense forests once covered India. The changing forest composition and cover can be closely linked to the growth and change of civilizations. Over the years, as man progressed, the forest began gradually depleting. The growing population and man's dependence on the forest may have been mainly responsible for this. All ancient texts have some mention of the forest and the activities that were performed in these areas. Forests were revered by the people, and a large number of religious ceremonies centered on trees and plants. Sacred groves were marked around the temples where certain rules and regulations applied. When Chandragupta Maurya came to power, he realized the importance of forests and appointed a high officer to look after the forests. Ashoka stated that wild animals and forests should be preserved and protected. He launched programs to plant trees on a large scale. During the Muslim invasions, a large number of people had to flee from the attacks and take refuge in the forests. This was the beginning of a phase of migration to the forest. They cleared vast areas of forest to make way for settlement. During the early part of the British rule, trees were felled without any thought. The history of modern Indian forestry was a process by which the British gradually appropriated forest resources for revenue generation. But after some time, the British began to regulate and conserve. Okay, so there are many more issues in this than we can really discuss here, and I'm not even going to touch any of the historical imagination here with the 10-foot pole. But the narrative structure is what I want us to look at is very clear. So forest loss and pre-colonial balance somehow, interestingly, coexist, although what we might call appropriately indigenous rulers, like the rulers of the Mauryan Empire, have really impeccable conservation credentials. Muslim invaders, though, upset the balance, a loss further accelerated under British colonialism. Science and management, colonial forestry intervene, however, in the kind of developmentalist mode, providing hope for the future. So it's really, I think, easy and quite fun, really, to look for storylines in science, in history, and in activism, and to think about the work that they do as narratives. But this is clearly, I think, not enough. I think we also have a responsibility to evaluate these empirically. So do the empirical bases of such narratives matter? Well, I think yes, of course they do, right? Even beside basic standards of veracity, because I think it's just important that we get it right, there are also, you might say, multiple interests at stake in any environmental narrative. Protecting our own interests in conservation and in livelihoods, I think, requires us to have a certain level of credibility. So Vasant Sabharwal, for example, has documented predictions of the imminent destruction that deforestation poses to the Himalayan slopes, written in more or less the same terms and in the same locations in texts dating hundreds of years apart. This infinitely receding horizon of disaster, I think, must eventually reduce the credibility of these kinds of accounts, right? So I think we do better to situate contemporary action on real historical footings or more solid historical footings rather than on simply assumed progressions or regressions of change. So the power of deforestation narratives derives in part, I think, from the hold that declensionist narratives in general have, but also perhaps from a kind of fuzziness or confusion about what prior conditions were. These vast tree-covered landscapes of the indefinite, we might say infinitely receding past, looming very large. Although, of course, there is certainly no doubt that deforestation has been significant in the past and continues to be a challenge. In India, curiously, several of the most persistent accounts of forest loss can be seen in locations where, as it turns out, there either never were any extensive forests, or where forest expansion may be quite recent, which really inverts the dominant narrative. So let's just take a quick look at two of those examples. So the floodplain of the river Ganges in northern India, oh, you already know all this, right, is one of the most fertile and densely settled parts of India today. The floodplain itself is really a work in progress, formed only during the late Quaternary, its contour shaped by meandering rivers. If any part of India seems fully cultural, this has got to be it. But even here, forests loom large in the imagination. For many years, archaeologists suggested that agriculture could only have been possible on the densely forested Gangetic Plain after the development of iron tools made plowing the heavy soils and clearing the dense forests possible. The first blow within archaeology to this heroic account of forests felled by iron axes came from the recognition that in other places, ancient people handily cut forests with stone axes, no problem, right? So the postulated resistance of Gangetic forests to farming began to seem less likely also as archaeologists began to look for pre-Iron Age settlements and found them. So clearly early farmers with stone tools did settle on the fertile, hydrologically active northern floodplains. And while talk of heavy soils declined, forest clearing was still presumed to have been an issue. Gangetic forests also show up in scholarship on later time periods too, with some environmental historians discussing the 17th and 18th century, imagining extensive forests on the Gangetic Plain. A sharp contrast between the current open landscape and colonial, what they presume to be colonial era forest loss. So forests thus play a role both in the progressivist narrative of a dense wood conquered by humans through technological ingenuity, the archaeology, and in a declensionist narrative of colonial rupture and loss in environmental history. But recent paleoecological studies, and I won't go through these, but we can talk about them if you want, show quite definitively that many parts of the Gangetic Plain were never densely forested at all, with pollen data showing open vegetation dominating throughout the Holocene. And there's plenty of diagrams. Certainly much more research is needed here, but the claim of unbroken forest cover must certainly be put to rest. So the different stories of Gangetic history then, showing how the forest was conquered or how very late forest loss was, are still built on the same foundational myth of Gangetic forests rather than on any specific kind of evidence for them. Okay, let's go south now, right to close to where we are now. So unlike the Gangetic Plain, the Western Ghats have considerable forest cover today. Often represented as being remote and exotic, the Ghat uplands have been opaque to mainstream history in a way that's allowed upland peoples to be represented both as ahistorical, as apart from the main currents of history, and also, at the same time, oddly, as agentive threats to contemporary biodiversity. For the last several thousand years, however, Ghat forest products featured prominently in circuits of international trade, with spices such as pepper of major economic importance. So many upland peoples then, later to be represented by anthropologists as untouched primitives, grew or gathered forest products for these trade networks for thousands of years. So thus, even the verdant green slopes of the Ghats cannot be seen as culture-free. At the highest elevations within this mountain, discourses of human remnants that I've written about in some detail gives way to declensionist narratives of forest remnants. So let's go right up to the top of the mountains now. Okay, so as we've seen, scientists can be just as prone as anyone else to structure narratives using imagined pasts. So while colonial era accounts of landscape change in the high elevation Nilgiri Hills blamed local groups for woodland loss, ecologists too have in the past represented the patchwork of forests and grasslands of the Nilgiris as products of loss. Open grasslands were sometimes argued to be degraded evergreen shola forests, newer culturalized places formed as products of degraded natural forests. Grasslands, it was argued, are recent human creations caused by grazing, burning, and cultivation. Many paleoenvironmental studies, however, show that this is almost exactly the reverse of the actual progression of vegetation change. So Caner et al., among others, show that grassland formations have characterized much of the vegetation above 1,500 meters since the late Pleistocene. Indeed, several studies of pollen, soils, and stable carbon isotopes show that some, not all, but some of the Nilgiri shola forest is of quite recent origin, formed within only the last 100 or 200 years. So most sampling locations, and again, there's definitely lots more work to be done, record upland grasslands in the early Holocene, open formations that were slowly afforested, either starting around 4,000 years ago, or in a few cases, other cases like in this diagram, more quickly transforming from grassland to forest during the last several hundred years. So in these high elevation areas then, paleoenvironmental data pose a significant challenge to ahistorical accounts of Nilgiri ecology, leading biologists to conclude that the patchiness of the shola forest is not a consequence of recent forest degradation for the most part. A nice example of the incompleteness of the hold that stories have over evidence, or you might say, or of our power to tell alternative stories. It's not all bad, right? So even in these newer accounts, though, humans are only ever mentioned as agents of forest destruction, with evidence for very recent forest expansion never attributed to human action, but always instead to climate change. So the patchy, though high elevation forests, so the Nilgiris, are certainly likely to have changed in response both to climate change and also, I think, activity, the latter possibly involving woodland expansion as well as woodland retreat. So let me just conclude these stories of phantom forest by pointing out that, of course, people have deforested many landscapes in South Asia. In my own study area in North Karnataka, for example, archaeological and remote sensing evidence shows us that human land use in the Neolithic and Iron Age, that is 5,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago and onward, led to both significant erosion off of these big granitic Inselbergs, or island mountains, as well as to the development of deep hillside terraces and colluvial deposition in the valleys below. In the later middle or medieval period, loss of woody cover, again, done by humans, was associated with significant episodes of erosion, which damaged irrigation infrastructure and endangered rural livelihoods. So our pollen work from samples atop the Karibakale Inselberg you saw on a previous slide then shows that pollen from certain woody climbers disappeared during the medieval period, never to regenerate again. So this is a very complex history. It's not all up and it's not all down. This complex history has no pre-human baseline and no simple trajectory. These same granitic hills that were a focus of settlement for almost 2,000 years, from the beginnings of agriculture to the period of early cities, and that have been subjected all this time to grazing, to burning, and plant collecting for some 5,000 years, are now recognized as being mini biodiversity hotspots, home to light and heat-loving plants and animals, including a number of endemic lichens, lizards, and turtles. And of course, sloth bears, not endemic, but they're cute. So the nearby forests of the Sandur Hills, where localized concentration of plant taxa, mostly seen in the foothills of the Western Ghats, forms a different kind of island than the granitic Inselbergs, also shows a more complex history than simple narratives of decline or progress might suggest. Again, based on our pollen data, we see that large-scale deforestation of these hills associated with the fluorescence of the city of Vijayanagara, here's your city, one of the largest cities in Asia in the early 16th century, so they cut down all the trees, it was really just a bad deal, was followed after the abandonment of the city by a period of woodland resurgence. But again, and this takes us to the questions of the Anthropocene, there do seem to be inflection points where trajectories of change become irreversible. In the Sandur Hills, for example, where iron production dates back to around 1200 BCE, large-scale mining of iron ore ahead of the Beijing Olympics has literally blasted away much of the hills, destroying archaeological sites, vegetation, and soils so thoroughly that really woodland recovery may no longer be possible here. So our work shows then, and other people's too, that there's no single way of being human in the world, right? No single kind of person, traditional, modern, Western, indigenous, who's uniquely destructive, or uniquely conserving of the environment. It's not really about who we are, it's about how we act. Okay. So given the pervasive appeal of simplistic narratives, then, it's worth thinking carefully about the work that the notion of the Anthropocene does as a declensionist narrative, one with a real family resemblance to the primitive modern dichotomy that we saw in both colonial and nationalist histories in India. Here too, in Anthropocene discourse, there can be a kind of progressivist twist. The arguments say that science and technology or progress is going to save us from our current crisis, despite perhaps also having caused the problem in the first place. So as I've recently argued in print, the search for geologically visible markers of the human, the golden spikes, amenable to stratigraphic specifications, has, I would say, come to overshadow work on the actual processes of anthropogenic change. As several scholars have noted, the Anthropocene concept constructs a narrative about humans as a species, effectively naturalizing the specific cultural behaviors, inequality, accumulation, colonialism, and more, that are really arguably responsible for elevated CO2 levels. Not all humans were or are equally responsible for climate changing effects, and yet the sense of both species level causation, more convincingly species level risks, unhelpfully, I would say, displaces analysis both from empirical change and from potential mitigation strategies. But despite its focus on species scale activity, the unitary global narrative of the Anthropocene has the perhaps unintended effect of creating what we might think of as one or more moments of ontological change within Homo sapiens, or within the history of our own species. If it was farming, for example, that led to our downfall, then foragers emerge as a different kind, or perhaps more virtuous kind of human than those bad forest-killing farmers, right? These other kinds of humans are, if somehow better than us, also curiously lacking in a kind of agency. That we have a really historical separation that is disturbingly similar to older narratives of progressivist movement towards civilization. So as I've argued for the specific histories of India, on a global scale too, we need to subject accounts of historical patterns of land use, human land use change and their impacts on vegetation, carbon cycling, and other factors of significance for climate change to actual empirical analysis. And this is indeed the focus of an ongoing project, Land Cover 6K, associated with PAGES, Past Global Changes, a multidisciplinary working group designed to evaluate the human impact on the Earth system over the last 6,000 years, and really a little bit more. Land Cover 6K aims to collate and commensurate historical, archaeological, and paleoecological evidence of both human land use and land cover or vegetation. So while we're still just getting started, it's clear that the variability of forms of human impact on the Earth system that we see in South Asia are not unique in the world. This isn't, of course, surprising, but by being able to quantify and this variability in a more robust way, we may end up unsettling some of the unitary narratives that animate the present moment. So while the empirical sufficiency or verification of these stories is absolutely important, I'm totally committed to it, it's also the case that both the work the Anthropocene concept does and the form it takes are very important. So I've argued that the Anthropocene as an idea is really unnecessary, not because humans have not changed the Earth, but because we've done so throughout the Holocene and more. As Lewis and Maslin, who wrote that Nature paper I put at the beginning, noted, the Holocene itself was originally defined to be an explicitly human era. Really, the Holocene is the Anthropocene. So to a surprising extent, this is a Swedish farm. I'll tell you what, it should become clear in a moment why we have a Swedish farm. So to a surprising extent, the Anthropocene industry operates by expanding Western European historical experiences, frameworks, and chronologies out onto the rest of the world. Boy, that's a familiar story, huh? Existing models of anthropogenic land cover change, ALCC, it's too hard to say anthropogenic land cover change all the time, tend to build out from Europe and from the temperate zones, taking other regions as a variance on this unmarked category. Okay. So most proposals for an Anthropocene adopt a rather limited historical perspective, assuming that significant environmental impact began only with the European, and especially the British, Industrial Revolution. This, of course, can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, with several influential papers considering evidence on land transformation by humans only for about the last 300 years, and then saying it's only been significant for the last 300 years. So while the significance of recent change is beyond doubt, I have to stress that, particularly coming from the insane country I live in, what's less clear, though, is how novel such change really is. So by shutting out consideration of longer-term change, we really foreclose the possibility that anthropogenic change has a longer, a more complex, or a more variable trajectory than is generally assumed. Elsewhere, which I shamelessly plug in this slide, I discuss the need to the Anthropocene concept, drawing on Dipesh Chakrabarty's argument against expanding European frameworks of history to other parts of the world. I won't repeat that entire argument here, except to point out how narratives of environmental change that we've already discussed in the context of India, specifically the declensionist myth of the primeval forest, also appear deep within the science of the Anthropocene in climate models. Okay, let's just quickly talk about climate briefly. So atmospheric circulation, ocean circulation, and land surface relationships are all important part of climate models, as I'm sure you know. Land surface relationships include vegetation as one factor affecting heat, moisture, and albedo, among other things. So vegetation or land cover thus plays a role in climate. Current models suffer, however, from an inability to model anthropogenic land cover change. That is, what have humans done to the vegetation? Instead, relying on simulations of climate-induced vegetation. So that's what's called potential natural vegetation. So if you know the climate is X, you can say the vegetation is Y, right? Potential natural vegetation. But we know, however, that humans have long modified vegetation and that potential natural vegetation has not always been the same as actual past vegetation. So one way to get over this conundrum, this lack of knowledge, is through modeling, right? So what are generally referred to as ALCC models, anthropogenic land cover change models, posit relationships between historic population levels and human-induced land cover change. Models of past anthropogenic land cover change differ significantly, though, so it's worth looking really quickly at how they operate. So just the main point you should take from this slide here is that you have two versions of Jed Kaplan's KK10 model and Case Klein-Goldwick's Hyde model and Julia Pongratz' model on the right, but you have basically four different models of what, I'm sorry, it should be grid cell under natural vegetation. So the more green it is, the more natural vegetation, the more light colored, the more human impact. But for the same period of time, around 8800 or the late Iron Age in Western Europe, these models predict very different kinds of parameters. Okay. Okay, so they don't use actual data on either human land use or land cover, that they take population figures and then, you know, say, as I like to say, multiply it by your favorite number. Okay, so the KK10 model developed by Jed Kaplan and his colleagues, for example, was originally based on a simulation of change of European vegetation for the last 3,000 years, taking Western Europe as a baseline for population land cover relationships and correcting for other regions. Other ALCC models work a bit differently, but they also tend towards global application of rules, which turn out to be derived entirely from understanding of European land use practices. So here's a global map. Again, this is a different time period, 2,000 years ago. I circled the Hyde model because the one most often used by climate modelers in testing their models. So 2,000 years ago, I hope you all know what's happening in India. And if you look like I do, right at your favorite little subcontinent there, you can see it's up almost entirely. It looks like it's all under natural vegetation, which is really shocking to those of us who spent our entire careers documenting archaeological sites, fields, etc. Okay, so the Hyde model uses various kinds of algorithms to allocate population data across the map, assuming, for example, that agriculturalists will always tend to settle near rivers, and which is derived from European settlement patterns, but not globally applicable. So hidden in the model assumptions, then, specific kinds of Eurocentric environmental narratives make their way into what seem to be dispassionate scientific assessments. Echoing India's imagined primeval forests, ALCC models also presume, this is really important, a singular trajectory of change from forest to open grassland or cropland for every single transition to farming. So this assumption is the one on which carbon budget calculations are made, imagines forests to have been a universal precursor to farming. So the temptation to take as unmarked categories both the label typically applied to early farming in Europe, the Neolithic, and the specific trajectory of change associated with farming in temperate Western Europe, where there really was a change from forest to open vegetation, appears very difficult for the modeling community to resist. They're taking a story from one little place and applying it to the globe. Okay. So Boyle et al., for example, presume that a single trajectory of change from forest to open grassland sufficiently characterizes all what they call Neolithic transitions. This assumption, around which they base their carbon budget calculations, imagines forests to have been a universal precursor to farming, right? They assume a carbon loss of around 13.4 kilograms per square meter with the transition to farming, And in order to convert population data to areas of cropland, they extend Sue Gregg's calculation of the amount of land needed by a hypothetical farming village in Neolithic Central Europe around 6500 BC to the entire globe for all time periods. Now, Sue Gregg's estimations are not intrinsically problematic, but what is problematic is the way in which a specifically temperate zone sense of land use and land cover change, and within that, a specifically European sense of process, has dominated the creation of these global assessments. Outside the small world of Europe, early farming often looked quite different. I give you some sense, trying to give a sense of variability in the bottom of the slide, right? So where, for example, tropical forests gave way to tropical agroforestry regimes, changes in carbon budget would probably have been less significant than what they calculate, while transitions to flooded field farming, like rice paddies, taro fields, would have been particularly quite a bit greater impact on carbon cycling, and of course also on things like methane, than figures drawn from temperate forest to grassland transitions. So already it's clear to us in this project that ALCC models seriously underestimate the extent of pre-industrial rice farming. And similarly, the vast areas of raised and flooded fields of the Americas, remnants of highly intensive forms of farming, are almost certainly vastly underestimated by these models. Okay, so how much does this all matter? Well, it might matter really a great deal. So Western Europe, for all that it's impressively well studied, actually covers a very modest proportion of the world, only about 7% of the Earth's land surface. The vast areas of the tropics are, in a global sense, more significant, really, a weighting which is not highly evident in scholarly attention or certainly in funding. As Malm and Hornberg have argued, Anthropocene narratives that depict humans as a species, as they put it, ascending to power over the rest of the Earth system, falsely naturalize intra-species variation and inequality in particular, noting that the creation of a fossil fuel economy is more the product of particular social relations rather than of essential human biology. And this is certainly also true of farming as a set of practices. Not only is agriculture much older than 6,000 years in many regions outside of Western Europe, including India, but it was and it is incredibly diverse. So the deep and complex legacy of anthropogenic environmental change, which is as yet poorly synthesized and quantified, really needs to be considered before we can conclude that the last centuries in the future are times of existential difference in human engagement with the Earth. This is not an argument about CO2 levels or about chronology, but really about how we understand human land use and its effect. So drawing a line at 1850 or 1945, I say really runs the risk of implying that earlier human environment interactions were qualitatively different, marked by different kinds of agents and different kinds of processes. And we already know this not to be true. So the search for Anthropocene beginnings falls within the larger project of seeking historical baselines, which separate humans from non-humans, quests for a time and place of human-free nature. Such a goal mirrors cultural histories, which pause fundamental transformations at moments of ontological change, like civilization or colonialism or modernity, positing the existence of an era prior to some kind of ecological fall from grace. But there really is no baseline. There's no Edenic state to be found. Humans have been part of the Earth system for much longer than the Holocene and have long been active agents of change. There's little compelling evidence for viewing the prehistoric, the pre-industrial, or pre-nuclear humans as somehow agentively different from us. No one disputes the fact that recent biogeophysical transformations are large, that they're significant, and they're dangerous. That is, no brain disputes that. But the current crisis, indeed, is what makes understanding the empirical record of historical land use and land cover change all that more imperative. So while there are empirical grounds for objecting to the creation of a new geological era, and I think more importantly for the idea of a new kind of relationship between humans and the Earth system, there's also something to me very disconcerting in a presumably global science, which is so powerfully built out from European chronologies, histories, ecologies, and models of land use. Potential natural vegetation easily gets reimagined as forests. And on some of those previous slides comparing Alcisi models, I wrote fraction of grid cell under natural vegetation. I had to correct the slide because my colleague, who really should know better, labeled them fraction of grid cell under forests. Okay, yeah, potential natural vegetation easily gets reimagined as forests, and calculations of carbon loss are made as if forests were the default natural state. Despite the fact that in many regions, early farming in the Middle East, for example, emerged in non-forested landscapes. So from entrenched nature-culture dualities to quests for human-free or modernity-free baselines to very specific strategies of modeling change, the cultural blinders that we wear and the stories that we tell may impede our understanding of the complex and diverse histories of humans in the Earth system. And this history of which long been, and I think hope to continue to be a part, is really far too important to limit in this way. Thank you.